There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people think they understand. They have seen the photographs. They have watched the documentaries. They have heard the veterans speak in careful, measured sentences about things that still wake them up at 3 in the morning. And most people walk away from those accounts believing that the war was simply misunderstood, that the tragedy came from confusion, from miscalculation, from the fog of an unusual conflict in an unfamiliar place. But that framing lets too many people off the hook too easily. The Vietnam War was not misunderstood. It was misrepresented. Systematically, deliberately, at every level of command, in every official channel, across more than a decade of active combat. The misrepresentation was not incidental to the war. It was structural. It was the architecture through which the war was built and sustained and eventually collapsed. And the soldiers who fought it, the ones who came back, and the ones who didn't, they knew. Most of them knew before the first year was over. They knew in the way that people who are living inside a reality know when the official version of that reality no longer resembles what they are experiencing. They knew in the way that makes a man go quiet at the dinner table when someone at home mentions something they read in the newspaper. They knew, and most of them said nothing. Not because they were cowards, but because the machinery of silence was already in place, and the consequences of speaking were clear, and the audience that might have listened was not yet ready to hear. This is not a story about heroes or villains, though there were both. This is a story about what happens when an institution continues to operate after its internal logic has already failed. What happens to the people inside it? What happens to the truth they carry? What happens to the words they use to describe what they saw? And what happens when those words are taken from them, replaced with cleaner language, sanitized for consumption by people who needed the war to be something other than what it was? The war in Vietnam lasted, depending on how you count, somewhere between 10 and 20 years of direct American involvement, with the most intense period running from the mid-1960s through the early 1970s. Approximately 58,000 Americans died. The Vietnamese death toll, military and civilian, north and south, runs into the millions. The exact number has never been agreed upon. That uncertainty is itself a part of the story. What is rarely discussed with any precision is how thoroughly the experience of fighting that war was managed, controlled, and ultimately distorted by the institutions that were supposed to be reporting it honestly. The Army, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the intelligence community, the State Department, the White House across multiple administrations, all of them participated in a sustained effort to present the war as something it was not. Not always through outright lying, though that happened too, but more commonly through the careful selection of which facts to emphasize, which metrics to report, which incidents to classify, which reports to file without action, and which soldiers to silence when their observations did not align with the preferred narrative. The soldiers at the bottom of that structure were left to navigate the gap between what they were told was happening and what they could see happening with their own eyes. That gap was enormous. It grew wider every year, and the men and women who lived inside it came home carrying a knowledge that had no official place to exist, stories that did not fit the narrative, experiences that the institutions they had served refused to acknowledge. What follows is drawn from that space, from declassified documents and congressional investigations, from veterans' testimonies collected over decades, from journalists who were there and filed reports that never ran, from historians who spent careers reconstructing what the official record deliberately left out. None of this is speculation. All of it is documented somewhere, even if the documentation itself is buried in archives that require effort to find. The first thing to understand about the Vietnam War's internal reality is the body count. The body count became, very early in the conflict, the primary metric by which success was measured. General William Westmoreland, who commanded American forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, operated under a strategy he called attrition. The theory was straightforward in concept and catastrophic in practice. Since the enemy could not be defeated by holding territory, since there was no capital to seize, no industrial heartland to bomb into submission, the war would be won by killing enemy combatants faster than they could be replaced. The measure of progress, therefore, was bodies. How many enemy soldiers had been killed in a given operation, a given week, a given month? The number became everything. It was reported up the chain of command. It was briefed to journalists at what soldiers and reporters alike came to call the 5 o'clock follies, the daily military press briefings in Saigon that became so reliably disconnected from observable reality that the name itself became a joke that everyone understood. The problem with using body count as the primary metric was not just that it created perverse incentives, though it did. The problem was deeper than that. The problem was that the body count was almost entirely fabricated, and everyone involved knew it. And the fabrication continued anyway. At the unit level, the pressure to produce results was constant and intense. Officers who reported low kill counts were passed over for promotion. Officers who reported high kill counts were rewarded. The incentive structure was explicit and unambiguous. You needed bodies, and if you did not have bodies, you needed numbers that looked like bodies. So the numbers were adjusted. A farmer killed in a free fire zone became an enemy combatant. A body found near a weapons cache, regardless of any other evidence, became a confirmed kill. Multiple units sometimes claimed credit for the same engagement. Civilians killed during operations were routinely counted as enemy dead on the principle, attributed to various commanders over the years, that if they were dead and Vietnamese and in a combat zone, they were probably the enemy. The soldiers who were doing the actual fighting watched this happen and understood what it meant. It meant that the war they were fighting existed in two versions simultaneously. There was the war on paper, with its rising kill ratios and improving metrics and quarterly progress reports that showed the enemy weakening, the pacification program advancing, the light at the end of the tunnel brightening. And there was the war on the ground, where the same villages were being swept and cleared again because nothing had actually changed, where the enemy appeared and disappeared at will, where American units took casualties in terrain they had already paid for in blood 6 months earlier. The two versions of the war were irreconcilable, and the men who lived in the second version were being asked to perform, report, and believe in the first. The silence around this started early. A soldier who questioned the kill count was questioning his officer. A soldier who questioned his officer was undermining unit cohesion and the chain of command. In an institution where the chain of command was everything, the cost of speaking was high and the benefit was unclear. So most men learned to write the number that was expected, to file the report that fit the template, and to keep the reality they had actually experienced somewhere separate, somewhere private, somewhere that did not appear in any official document. There were soldiers who tried to resist this. There were young officers who filed accurate reports, who refused to inflate their numbers, who wrote after-action assessments that reflected what had actually happened. Some of them were quietly reassigned. Some received poor performance evaluations that ended careers they had expected to build. A few were openly censured. The lesson was clear, and it was received clearly. The institution did not want accuracy. It wanted the appearance of progress. Accuracy and the appearance of progress were not the same thing, and when forced to choose, the institution chose appearance. This was not a secret. The gap between the reported war and the actual war was visible to enough people at enough levels that it generated internal dissent within the military itself. There were studies conducted, analyses prepared, assessments written by military intelligence professionals and civilian analysts that concluded, in language that was direct, if carefully bureaucratic, that the official metrics did not reflect battlefield reality, that the attrition strategy was not working, that the enemy's capacity to sustain the conflict had been systematically underestimated. These studies were written. They were distributed within appropriate channels. They were read by people in positions of authority. And then, in most cases, they were quietly set aside, classified at levels that prevented wider distribution, or simply ignored while the official narrative continued unchanged. The most famous example of this internal dissent is the Sam Adams affair, but it is rarely told in its full dimensions. Sam Adams was a CIA analyst who spent years in the 1960s developing estimates of enemy troop strength in Vietnam. His analysis, based on captured documents and other intelligence, consistently produced numbers significantly higher than the official figures being used by the military. The reason this mattered was not abstract. If the enemy had more troops than the official figures acknowledged, then the attrition strategy could not be working as claimed. The kill ratios that looked impressive on paper would look very different against a larger denominator. The war would look not like a conflict being won, but like a conflict being sustained indefinitely by an enemy with more resources than anyone was admitting. Adams pushed his findings through official channels for years. He encountered resistance at every level. The official military estimates were lower than his, and the official military estimates were what went to the White House, what went to Congress, what shaped policy. When he attempted to have his analysis reconsidered, he was repeatedly blocked. The details of what happened to his work, how it was suppressed, revised, and ultimately contradicted by the reality of the Tet Offensive in January of 1968, became the subject of congressional investigation and a famous lawsuit years later. But the essential point is simpler than the legal complexity. There were people inside the American government who knew the official picture of the war was wrong, who documented that it was wrong, and who were prevented from making that knowledge the basis of policy. The war continued on the basis of numbers that the people generating those numbers did not fully believe. The Tet Offensive changed the public perception of the war in a way that years of journalism and protest had not quite managed. When North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and outposts across South Vietnam in late January of 1968, attacking the American embassy compound in Saigon itself, the gap between the official narrative and observable reality became impossible to maintain. The official narrative had been that the enemy was weakening, that pacification was working, that the light at the end of the tunnel was real. Tet demonstrated in front of television cameras that were already positioned throughout South Vietnam, that the enemy had the capacity to plan and execute a massive coordinated offensive against targets that should have been among the most secure in the country. It was not a military victory for North Vietnam. The offensive was repulsed with significant enemy losses. But it was a catastrophic psychological defeat for the American government's credibility because it proved, in terms that required no interpretation, that the official picture of the war had been wrong. The men who had been fighting the ground war in Vietnam did not need Tet to tell them this. They had been living with the reality behind the official picture for years. What Tet did was make the official picture collapse in public. And what happened after that collapse is in many ways more important to understanding the war's internal culture than the collapse itself. Because after Tet, after the official narrative lost its credibility, after Walter Cronkite went on television and declared the war a stalemate, after Lyndon Johnson announced he would not seek re-election, the war did not end. It continued. For another 7 years, it continued. With the same structures, the same institutional incentives, the same gap between what was reported and what was experienced, the same silence enforced at the unit level, the same inflation of metrics, the same suppression of dissenting analysis. The credibility had collapsed, but the machinery kept running. This is one of the things about the Vietnam War that is hardest to explain to people who were not inside it. The war did not become more honest after the official narrative failed. If anything, it became more carefully managed, because now the management was not about maintaining confidence, but about preventing the full extent of what had happened from becoming visible. The Nixon administration's prosecution of the war was characterized by a particular kind of institutional dishonesty that was different in texture from what had come before. Where the Johnson administration had genuinely believed, at least in its early years, that the official metrics represented something real, the Nixon administration operated with a clearer awareness that the numbers were not the reality, and managed them accordingly. The soldiers who continued to fight the war through the Nixon years were fighting in a particular kind of psychological environment. The broader public had already concluded the war was not going well. The anti-war movement was visible and vocal. The men arriving in Vietnam after 1968 often arrived with a different set of expectations than those who had arrived in 1965 or 1966. They arrived knowing, in a general way, that the official story was not reliable. But knowing this in the abstract was different from navigating it at the unit level, where the institutional machinery of silence and performance was still fully operational, where careers were still being made and broken on the basis of metrics that everyone knew were compromised, where the daily reality of combat had not become any less dangerous simply because the narrative justifying it had become less coherent. The fragging phenomenon is one of the clearest expressions of how completely the internal culture of the American military in Vietnam deteriorated during this period. Fragging refers to the killing or attempted killing of officers and NCOs by their own troops, most commonly using fragmentation grenades, which is where the term originated. It is one of the most documented and least discussed aspects of the war, because it represents a form of institutional failure that the military has never had a comfortable way to acknowledge. The official record is imprecise because many fragging incidents were reported as combat casualties or accidents, but estimates based on Pentagon records and subsequent investigation suggest that between 1969 and 1971 alone, there were hundreds of confirmed or suspected fragging incidents, resulting in dozens of deaths and many more injuries. The circumstances that produced fragging were specific. They grew from the combination of deteriorating unit cohesion, the increasing perception that the war had no achievable objective, the specific danger created by officers who prioritized metrics over soldier safety, and a racial and class tension within the military that the institution was almost entirely unwilling to address directly. Soldiers who felt that their lives were being spent in service of a meaningless objective, commanded by officers whose primary concern was their own career advancement, officers who ordered aggressive patrols, not because they served any strategic purpose, but because aggressive patrol statistics looked good on reports, reached a point where the threat posed by their own chain of command seemed more immediate than the threat posed by the enemy. That this happened at all, that it happened as often as it did, is a measure of how completely the institutional relationship between the military and the people it was asking to fight had broken down. The men who participated in fragging incidents were not, as a category, unstable or criminal. Many of them were soldiers who had performed well by every conventional measure. Many of them returned home and led unremarkable civilian lives. The fragging itself was not a symptom of individual pathology. It was a symptom of an institution that had lost the capacity to be honest about what it was doing and why, and had therefore also lost the capacity to ask its soldiers to trust it. The issue of race in the Vietnam War is another area where the official record and the lived reality diverged dramatically. The military presented itself as an integrated institution, and in formal terms it was. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been passed. The military had been officially desegregated since 1948, but the war was fought at a time when the broader civil rights struggle in America was at its most intense, when the assassination of Martin Luther King had occurred in 1968, when race riots had burned in American cities, when the relationship between Black Americans and American institutions was under profound and public stress. And the men fighting in Vietnam lived inside all of that, with no way to leave it behind when they put on a uniform. Black soldiers in Vietnam were disproportionately assigned to combat roles. The data on this is clear and has been analyzed extensively. The selective service system, the college deferment system, the mechanisms by which middle-class white Americans avoided service while lower-income and minority Americans did not, all of these produced a combat force that was racially and economically skewed in ways that the official presentations of the war did not acknowledge. Within units, racial tensions that were visible and documented by military investigators throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s were managed, when they were managed at all, through suppression rather than address. Soldiers who raised racial grievances were disciplined. Incidents that had racial dimensions were reported in ways that obscured those dimensions. The military's internal investigators wrote assessments that described the racial situation in Vietnam as serious and deteriorating, and those assessments were classified and filed, and the situation continued to deteriorate. The specific pressure on black soldiers in Vietnam was layered in ways that are difficult to fully convey. They were being asked to fight for a country that was simultaneously denying their families basic civil rights. They were being asked to serve in an institution that formally prohibited discrimination, but practiced it in assignment, promotion, and discipline. They were watching, through letters and the occasional news report, as American cities burned in response to the killing of a man who had spent his life advocating nonviolence, while the government that had failed to protect him continued to ask for their service and their lives. And when they expressed any of this, when the tension between what they were being asked to do and what was being done to their communities at home became audible in their conduct or their words, the institutional response was discipline, not dialogue. The military justice system in Vietnam was another area of profound and documented injustice that the official record did not capture honestly. Black soldiers were court-martialed at rates significantly higher than white soldiers for comparable offenses. They received harsher sentences. They were more likely to receive dishonorable discharges, which carried consequences that followed them for the rest of their lives, affecting their ability to find employment, access veterans' benefits, and participate fully in civilian society. Congressional investigations into military justice in Vietnam found these disparities clearly and documented them in reports that were submitted, discussed, and largely ignored as the war continued. The soldiers living inside this system knew it was not fair. They said so in the ways available to them. The institution's response was to manage the expression of grievance rather than address the grievance itself. The treatment of post-traumatic stress, which was not yet called that during the war itself, represents another dimension of the gap between institutional presentation and lived reality. Combat trauma had been documented by military medicine since the First World War, when it was called shell shock, and through the Second World War, when it was called combat fatigue. By the time of the Vietnam War, military psychiatrists and medical personnel had access to decades of research establishing that sustained exposure to combat produced psychological effects that were predictable, serious, and treatable if addressed properly. The military's response to this knowledge in Vietnam was, in practical terms, to suppress it. Soldiers who reported psychological symptoms were managed in ways designed to keep them operational for as long as possible, not to treat the underlying condition. The goal was man-hours, the same goal that governed every other aspect of the institution's management of its human resources in Vietnam. A soldier reporting anxiety, nightmares, hypervigilance, or other recognizable symptoms of combat trauma was likely to be told to rest, given medication that blunted the symptoms without addressing their cause, and returned to duty. Soldiers who were too obviously impaired to return to combat were sometimes evacuated, but this was treated as a logistical problem, not a medical one. The paperwork that followed them often characterized their condition in ways that minimized its severity, both because accurate characterization would have reflected poorly on the unit's combat effectiveness metrics, and because the institution did not want to acknowledge the extent to which it was consuming its own people. The men who came home with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder came home to a veterans system that was structurally unprepared and often unwilling to acknowledge what they were carrying. The Veterans Administration, as it was then called, operated with diagnostic categories and treatment protocols that had been designed primarily around the experience of World War II veterans. The Vietnam veterans' experience was different in ways the institution was slow to recognize and slower still to accommodate. The war had not ended with a clear victory and a homecoming parade. It had ended, for each soldier, with a flight home and a return to civilian life so abrupt that many veterans described it as disorienting in a way they could not fully articulate. On Tuesday, you were in the field. By Thursday, you were at your parents' house and your mother was asking if you wanted more potatoes. The silence that met Vietnam veterans at home was not only social, Though the social dimension was real and painful, it was institutional. The VA did not have the language or the framework to address what the veterans were carrying, and in many cases, it did not try particularly hard to develop them. Veterans who sought help were often told that their symptoms were not service-connected, which had specific legal and financial consequences that affected their access to treatment and compensation. The rate at which Vietnam veterans' psychological claims were denied, the consistency with which the institutional record attempted to separate the veteran's current condition from his service, was another expression of the same institutional logic that had governed the war itself. The logic of managing the appearance of the institution's performance rather than honestly assessing its actual effects. There were specific incidents in the Vietnam War, events that occurred, were witnessed by multiple people, were occasionally investigated internally, but were never publicly acknowledged or prosecuted at any level commensurate with their severity. These incidents exist in the historical record in fragments. A declassified document here, a veteran's testimony there, a journalist's notes, an investigator's report that was completed and then quietly buried. They represent some of the most significant silences in the war's history, places where the gap between what happened and what was recorded became a permanent and deliberate absence. The massacre at My Lai in March of 1968 became, after it was exposed by journalist Seymour Hersh in 1969, the most publicly known of these incidents. But the way My Lai became public, and what happened after it became public, and what did not happen after it became public, tells a story that is as important as the massacre itself. In March of 1968, soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry, 11th Brigade, Americal Division, entered the village of My Lai and killed somewhere between 300 and 500 unarmed civilians, primarily old men, women, and children. The killing took several hours. It was witnessed by dozens of soldiers. It was known to officers at multiple levels of the chain of command within a short time of its occurrence. The official report filed about the operation described it as a successful combat engagement with enemy forces, citing a kill count and minimal American casualties. The report was accepted, filed, forwarded up the chain, and used as part of the ongoing statistical case that the war was being won. For more than a year, the massacre existed only in the memories of the people who had participated in it or witnessed it, and in a letter written by soldier Ron Riddenauer, who had heard about it from other soldiers and spent months trying to get someone in authority to investigate. Riddenauer's letter, sent to Congress and the Pentagon in March of 1969, was what finally initiated the investigation that led to Hersh's reporting and the subsequent Army Criminal Investigation Division inquiry. What the investigation found, and what the subsequent courts-martial revealed, was that the massacre had been known at various levels of command and had been covered up. Helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson, who had witnessed the killing from the air and had radioed reports of what he was seeing, had filed formal complaints that had been handled in ways designed to prevent them from going further. The official investigation was limited in scope and resulted in the conviction of only one man, Lieutenant William Calley, whose sentence was subsequently commuted through a series of political decisions that left him serving about 3 years under house arrest for the killing of at least 22 people. The officers above him, who had known, who had filed false reports, who had managed the cover-up, were never prosecuted. Most of them completed their military careers normally. What the military's own investigation also found, and what is far less commonly discussed, is that My Lai was not an isolated incident. The investigation, which came to be known as the Peers Commission, documented evidence of numerous other incidents in the same general area, same time period, same division, that suggested a pattern of conduct that went well beyond a single rogue operation. These findings were classified. They were not released publicly for decades. The story that entered the public record was that My Lai was an aberration, a terrible event committed by men under unusual stress, not representative of how the war was being fought. The Peers Commission's own findings suggested otherwise, but those findings were not the story that was told. The broader pattern of civilian casualties in Vietnam is another area where the official record and the documented reality are profoundly different. Free fire zones, which were areas designated by military command where anyone present could be presumed to be the enemy and treated accordingly, covered large portions of South Vietnam at various points in the war. The logic behind them was military, but the effect was that civilians who had not left designated areas for whatever reason, because they had nowhere to go, because they were too old or too young to travel, because they had refused to leave their ancestral land, because they had not received or understood evacuation orders, could be killed legally under military rules of engagement. The rules of engagement themselves were classified and were not made publicly available, which meant that the framework within which killing civilians was permissible was itself kept from the public view. The Strategic Hamlet program, which had been designed to separate the rural population from Viet Cong influence by relocating them to government-controlled villages, had in practice displaced enormous numbers of people, destroyed communities that had existed for generations, and created the resentment and instability that it was supposed to prevent. The program's failures were documented internally. The documentation was classified. The program continued. Millions of Vietnamese people were moved from their villages into camps that were often inadequately supplied and secured, and the official reports describing the program's progress bore almost no relationship to the conditions inside the hamlets themselves. The air war in Vietnam, and particularly the bombing campaigns that operated under various code names across more than a decade, represents another dimension of the war's institutional dishonesty that has still not been fully reckoned with. Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that ran from 1965 to 1968, was presented as a measured, calibrated application of military pressure designed to compel North Vietnam to negotiate. The targets were chosen to minimize civilian casualties while maximizing military impact. This was the official description. The classified assessments of the campaign's actual effects told a different story. The bombing did not compel North Vietnam to negotiate on terms acceptable to the United States. The physical damage it caused was real and extensive, but North Vietnam's capacity to sustain the war was not broken. The civilian casualties, which were acknowledged in classified assessments as significant, were not reflected in public descriptions of the campaign. The pilots flying the missions operated under rules of engagement that changed frequently, that were sometimes contradictory, that required them to identify specific target types, but gave them limited ability to verify what they were seeing from altitude, and that required them to report what they had hit in terms of specific target categories that sometimes bore limited relationship to what they had actually struck. The reporting system for air operations suffered from the same institutional incentive problem as the ground war's body count. Successful missions were defined by specific metrics that could be measured and reported, and the pressure to produce successful missions created pressure to report outcomes in the terms that looked like success, regardless of what had actually occurred. The bombing of Cambodia is a particular case of institutional dishonesty that operated at the highest levels of the American government and was known to be dishonest by everyone involved at the time it occurred. Beginning in March of 1969, the Nixon administration authorized a secret bombing campaign against suspected North Vietnamese supply routes and base areas in Cambodia. The campaign was designated Operation Menu, with individual components named after courses: breakfast, lunch, snack, dinner, dessert, and supper. It was conducted under a reporting system specifically designed to conceal it from Congress and from the American public. The crews flying the missions knew they were bombing Cambodia. The controllers directing the missions knew. The commanders who authorized the missions knew. The reporting system created a parallel set of false records showing that the missions had been conducted in South Vietnam, with the real records kept in a separate system, accessible only to those cleared for the program. This was not a minor bureaucratic irregularity. It was a systematic falsification of official military records designed to prevent congressional oversight of a significant military operation in a country with which the United States was not at war. When the bombing was eventually reported by the New York Times in May of 1969, the Nixon administration's response was not to acknowledge it, but to conduct wiretaps of journalists and government officials suspected of leaking the information, an early step in a pattern of institutional response to truth that would eventually produce Watergate. The bombing of Laos, which was even more extensive than the bombing of Cambodia and which continued over a longer period, was similarly secret in its early phases and similarly dishonest in its official characterization when it was eventually acknowledged. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of supply routes running through eastern Laos that was the primary logistical artery for North Vietnamese forces in the south, was bombed continuously for years. The civilian population of eastern Laos was displaced and killed in numbers that are still not fully counted. The official American position was that the bombing was surgical, precise, targeted at military infrastructure, carefully calibrated to minimize civilian harm. The actual record, pieced together from declassified documents, pilot accounts, and the testimony of Laotian survivors, describes something considerably more indiscriminate. Laos became, per capita, the most heavily bombed country in the history of warfare. The unexploded ordnance left behind by those bombing campaigns continues to kill and injure Laotian civilians to this day. Children still lose limbs and lives to cluster munitions dropped 50 years ago. This is not a metaphor, it is a current, ongoing reality. The bombs did not stop being lethal when the war ended. The official record of why the bombing was conducted, what it was intended to achieve, and what it actually achieved remains incomplete and in significant portions classified. The Phoenix program represents another category of institutional action in Vietnam that was simultaneously official policy, systematically misrepresented, and largely kept from public understanding for years. The Phoenix program was a joint American-South Vietnamese effort to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, meaning the political and administrative network that supported Viet Cong military operations in the South. The program operated from approximately 1968 to 1972, was administered through the CIA with significant involvement from the military and South Vietnamese intelligence services, and resulted in the reported neutralization of tens of thousands of individuals. Neutralization was defined to include capture and defection, but it also included killing. The program operated outside the normal military chain of command and with limited oversight. The targeting process, the mechanism by which individuals were identified as members of the Viet Cong infrastructure and therefore subject to neutralization, was acknowledged internally to be unreliable. The lists of names were compiled from sources of varying credibility, from informants who might have personal grievances against specific individuals, from intelligence assessments that were themselves based on limited information, from South Vietnamese officials who sometimes used the program to settle scores or eliminate political rivals. The result was that people were killed, captured, and in some cases tortured by Phoenix program operatives on the basis of identifications that were never independently verified and were sometimes simply wrong. The program's own internal assessments acknowledge this. The quotas that were imposed on provincial operations, numerical targets for neutralizations that created pressure to produce results regardless of the quality of the intelligence, were recognized within the program itself as a problem. The recognition did not prevent the quotas from continuing. Congressional testimony about the Phoenix program in the early 1970s produced accounts of specific abuses, including torture and extrajudicial killing, that were met with official denial, qualified acknowledgement, and promises of reform that were made as the program was already winding down. The intelligence community's role in the Vietnam War is another dimension that the official history has consistently undersold. The CIA's involvement went well beyond the Phoenix program. Covert operations that began in Vietnam before direct American military involvement provided the early infrastructure of the war's intelligence apparatus. The agency's assessments of the conflict's progress, which, as in Sam Adams' case, often diverged significantly from the military's official picture, were subject to political pressure in ways that compromised their integrity. The relationship between intelligence analysis and policy decision-making in Vietnam became another space where the gap between reality and official representation was routinely managed in favor of the preferred narrative. Specific programs that operated under CIA sponsorship or oversight, including programs involving paramilitary forces, irregular troops, and operations in countries where the United States officially had no military presence, were classified at levels that prevented any meaningful public accountability for decades. Some of them have been partially declassified. Many have not. The full scope of covert activity conducted under American authority in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War era has never been publicly disclosed, and the documents that would enable a complete accounting remain classified or have been destroyed. The treatment of prisoners of war, both American prisoners held by North Vietnam and prisoners taken by American forces, is another area where the official record and the documented reality are significantly different. American prisoners held in North Vietnam endured conditions and treatment that the North Vietnamese government routinely denied, and the American government accurately described as brutal. The treatment of enemy prisoners taken by American forces, which was subject to the Geneva Conventions and to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, is documented in the official record as consistently compliant with legal requirements. The documented reality is considerably more complicated. Prisoners taken in the field were often interrogated before being transferred to formal prisoner of war facilities. The interrogation techniques used, particularly in the early years of the war, were not consistently the techniques permitted by the Geneva Conventions. The use of physical coercion, stress positions, and other prohibited methods was documented in internal reports that were classified and in some cases destroyed. The transfer of prisoners to South Vietnamese custody, which the official record describes as a legally compliant process, was in practice a mechanism by which American forces could distance themselves from what happened to prisoners during interrogation, since South Vietnamese interrogation practices were documented as significantly more brutal, and the transfer formally ended American legal responsibility for the prisoners' treatment. The specific practice of throwing prisoners from helicopters, which appears in multiple veterans' testimonies and journalistic accounts, was officially denied and never formally investigated in any systematic way. Individual incidents were sometimes investigated at the unit level. The results of those investigations were classified or resulted in administrative rather than criminal action. The institution's approach to documented prisoner abuse was consistent with its approach to other documented misconduct. Manage the visibility of the incident, minimize the official record, prevent accountability at levels above the individual soldier, and continue operations. The role of drugs in Vietnam is another subject that exists simultaneously in popular culture and in institutional silence. Marijuana use among American soldiers in Vietnam was widespread and openly acknowledged by everyone who served there. Heroin use, which became significant in the late 1960s and early 1970s, was more serious in its effects and less comfortable for the institution to acknowledge. The availability of high-quality heroin in Vietnam, much of it flowing through supply chains that involved South Vietnamese military and political figures who were American allies, was documented by journalists, by government investigators, and by the soldiers themselves. The institutional response was to emphasize individual soldier weakness and criminality rather than the systemic conditions that had created the problem. The broader context, including the involvement of CIA-affiliated operations in the drug trade in Southeast Asia, remains one of the most thoroughly documented and least officially acknowledged aspects of the war's political economy. The physical and chemical environment of the war produced long-term consequences that the military was slow to acknowledge and slower still to compensate. Agent Orange, the defoliant sprayed across millions of acres of South Vietnam as part of Operation Ranch Hand and related programs, contained dioxin, one of the most toxic synthetic chemicals known. The connection between dioxin exposure and serious health conditions including cancer, neurological damage, and birth defects was known to scientists before the spraying began. The military's internal record shows awareness of toxicity concerns that was not reflected in the safety guidance provided to the soldiers applying and working near the chemical. Veterans who returned home and began experiencing the health conditions associated with dioxin exposure spent years fighting the Veterans Administration for recognition that their illnesses were service-connected. The VA's consistent position, maintained for decades, was that the evidence of a connection was insufficient. The legal and political process by which Agent Orange disability claims were eventually recognized involved congressional legislation, class action litigation, and eventually an act of Congress that shifted the burden of proof for certain conditions, because the normal evidentiary process had been so consistently used to deny legitimate claims. The Vietnamese civilians and soldiers who were exposed to the chemical at levels far higher than American service members and who have experienced health consequences across multiple generations have received almost no recognition or compensation from the American government. The war generated a specific culture of self-preservation within the military bureaucracy that shaped how every aspect of it was reported and managed. Officers whose careers were built on the conventional track of successful assignments and strong efficiency reports, the documents through which a military officer's performance was evaluated, understood that the metric of success in Vietnam was the appearance of progress. This created a system in which everyone who cared about their career had an incentive to contribute to a false picture of how the war was going. And everyone who reported accurately had an incentive to do so quietly and without making an issue of it, if they reported accurately at all. The efficiency report system itself became a mechanism of institutional distortion. Officers were rated by their superiors on scales that covered everything from tactical competence to leadership ability to personal bearing. An officer who was rated poorly was unlikely to advance. An officer who made his superior uncomfortable by reporting inconvenient realities was likely to receive ratings that reflected that discomfort. The system created over time a senior officer corps in Vietnam that had been selected in part for its willingness to operate within the institutional fiction, because those were the officers who had survived long enough to be promoted. The officers who had questioned the official picture, who had filed accurate reports, who had pushed back against unrealistic expectations, were statistically more likely to have been passed over, reassigned, or pressured out of the service. The institution had systematically sorted itself toward officers who would tell it what it wanted to hear. This selection effect was visible to everyone who worked within the system and is documented in memoirs, oral histories, and official investigations conducted after the war. It is one of the reasons why the Army's own retrospective assessments of its institutional performance in Vietnam were so devastating. Studies conducted within the military after the war's end, studies with titles like A Study of Strategic Lessons Learned in Vietnam, documented with unusual candor the ways in which the institutional culture had actively undermined honest assessment and accurate reporting. These studies, some of which were classified for years, concluded that the military had not simply made strategic mistakes in Vietnam, but had created structural conditions that made learning from those mistakes difficult or impossible. The institutional culture that rewarded the appearance of success over honest assessment had been self-reinforcing, and the damage it had done extended beyond the Vietnam War into the institution's capacity for honest self-evaluation going forward. The soldiers who came home from Vietnam came home into a country that did not know how to receive them. The social and political context of their return was unlike any previous American war. They had not won. The cause had not been clearly defined. The moral status of what they had done was contested in a way that was visible and vocal. They came home to protests that sometimes expressed contempt for the soldiers themselves, not only for the policy. They came home to a veteran system that was underfunded, philosophically unprepared for their experience, and institutionally hostile to acknowledging the extent of the damage the war had done. They came home to families and communities that wanted them to be okay, that needed them to be okay, that did not have the framework to understand why they were not okay. The silence that descended on the Vietnam veterans' experience in the years immediately after the war had multiple sources. Some of it came from the veterans themselves, who had learned in the field that speaking was more dangerous than staying quiet, that the institutions around them were not reliably interested in accuracy, that the gap between what they had experienced and what people at home could understand was probably not bridgeable in casual conversation. Some of it came from the social environment, which was saturated with the war in ways that had exhausted the capacity for careful listening. Some of it came from the political environment, which had moved on to other crises and found the ongoing reality of what the war had done to the people who had fought it an uncomfortable subject. The institutional dimension of the silence was most consequential in the long run. The military, having just survived the most significant credibility crisis in its modern history, was not interested in extended public examination of the mechanisms that had produced that crisis. The political system, having just managed the transition from an unsuccessful war to a negotiated withdrawal, was not interested in the kind of accountability that would have required it to examine its own role in sustaining the misrepresentation. The intelligence community, whose internal assessments had been consistently more accurate than the official picture and had been consistently overridden by political pressure, was not in a position to make that history public. The result was a managed silence that allowed everyone who had been involved in sustaining the war's official narrative to move forward without being required to account for what they had done. The veterans who carried the knowledge of specific incidents, who had witnessed specific acts that should have been prosecuted but were not, who had filed reports that disappeared, who had been ordered to do things that they understood were wrong, and had done them anyway because the alternative was not survivable. These men came home with material that had no official place to go. The war crimes investigation that was conducted by the Army after My Lai, the Peers Commission, documented enough additional incidents to have generated prosecutions extending far beyond Lieutenant Calley. But the political decision was made at the highest levels that this would not happen. The decision was not made publicly. It was made in the way that most significant decisions about what would and would not be prosecuted in the Vietnam War were made, quietly, institutionally, without explanation. The Winter Soldier hearings, organized by Vietnam veterans against the war in January and February of 1971, were an attempt by veterans themselves to create a public record of what they had witnessed and done. More than 100 veterans testified over several days in Detroit, describing specific incidents of war crimes, rules of engagement violations, and institutional conduct that they had personally witnessed. The hearings were covered in limited fashion by mainstream media and were largely dismissed by the military and the Nixon administration as unverified accounts from disgruntled soldiers. The subsequent investigation of specific claims by military investigators produced findings that were classified. The veterans who testified were subjected to surveillance by military intelligence and in some cases experienced consequences that suggested the institution was more interested in tracking who had spoken than in examining what they had described. The institution's management of the war's legacy was itself a form of the same institutional behavior that had characterized the war. The preference for managing visibility over addressing reality, for protecting the institution's reputation over acknowledging its failures, for suppressing inconvenient truth rather than building honest accountability into the record, persisted into the post-war period and shaped how the war was officially remembered and officially taught. The Vietnam War's long-term effect on American military culture is a subject that military historians have examined with varying degrees of candor. The reforms that came after Vietnam, the adoption of an all-volunteer force, the restructuring of military education and training, the development of new doctrines and operational concepts. These were real changes made in response to real failures that the war had exposed. But the deeper institutional culture, the preference for metrics over judgment, the system of advancement that rewarded the appearance of success, the management of information in ways that protected institutional reputation rather than served honest assessment, these were harder to change. They were embedded in the institution structure in ways that required more than doctrinal revision to address. The specific lesson about body count, about the danger of using quantitative metrics as a substitute for qualitative judgment in complex environments, was stated explicitly in post-Vietnam military education and doctrine. It was stated, and then, in subsequent conflicts, many of the same dynamics recurred in different forms. The metrics changed. The fundamental pattern of institutional preference for measurable progress over honest assessment proved more durable than the specific instruments through which it had been expressed in Vietnam. There were men who had served in Vietnam who spent decades trying to make the full record available. Historians like Christian Appy and Nick Turse, journalists who continued investigating long after the war ended, veterans who gave oral history interviews to universities and archives, investigators who filed Freedom of Information Act requests for classified documents. They produced a body of knowledge that gradually expanded the public understanding of what the war had actually been. The process was slow and incomplete, and continues to this day. Documents are still being declassified. Archives are still being processed. Veterans who stayed silent for 40 years occasionally begin to speak. The full record of what occurred in Vietnam during the years of American involvement has not yet been compiled. It may never be. The gap between what was reported and what occurred is particularly significant with respect to civilian deaths. The official American position throughout the war, and largely in the historical literature that followed it, was that American operations were conducted with attention to avoiding civilian casualties, that free fire zones and strategic hamlet programs and bombing campaigns were calibrated to minimize harm to non-combatants, that while civilian deaths occurred, they were not the intended result of American policy. The documented record is considerably more complicated. Internal assessments from the period acknowledge civilian casualties in ways that the official public record does not. The rules of engagement, which changed frequently and were often classified, created conditions under which killing civilians was legal under military law, even when it was not publicly defensible. The term collateral damage, which entered common usage in the Vietnam War era, is itself a document of institutional language management. The phrase performs a specific function. It accepts the fact of civilian killing while placing it in a category that sounds accidental and incidental. It implies that the primary intent was military and the civilian death was an unfortunate byproduct. It does not engage with the question of whether the operation that caused the civilian death was itself justified, whether the intelligence that identified the military target was reliable, whether the expected military benefit was proportionate to the predicted civilian harm. It takes the moral complexity of a specific act, a specific decision, a specific set of deaths, and converts it into a category, a type of thing that happens in war, a cost of doing business rather than an act requiring individual accountability. The language became standard. The reality it described did not change. The men who were there saw both the language and the reality, and understood the distance between them. One of the most consistent themes in Vietnam veteran accounts, from across the decades of testimony and oral history and memoir that followed the war, is the experience of returning home and finding that the country had already decided what the war was. The narrative had been set before the veterans arrived to complicate it. It was either a noble effort, frustrated by political failure, or a criminal enterprise that should never have been undertaken, and neither of these framings made room for the actual texture of what the men who had been there had experienced. Both framings required the veterans' specific knowledge to be translated, simplified, fit into a story that had already been written. The veterans' specific knowledge, which was irreducibly particular, which existed at the level of specific people in specific places, doing specific things for specific reasons, did not translate cleanly into either version. This is one reason why many veterans maintained a silence that looked from the outside like reticence, but was experienced from the inside as something more active. It was not that they had nothing to say. They had things to say that the available frameworks could not receive. The language that existed for talking about the war, whether in the civilian media or in veterans' institutional settings or at the dinner table, was not adequate to the experience they were carrying. so they said less. They kept the full version inside, where it continued to work on them in ways that eventually produced the psychological consequences that the VA was so reluctant to recognize. The issue of medals and decorations is another area where the war's institutional culture produced specific and documented distortions. Medals were awarded, in the Vietnam War as in all American wars, to recognize acts of valor, service, and accomplishment. The system was supposed to be a mechanism for honest acknowledgement of what individuals had done. In practice, the same institutional pressures that corrupted the body count and the efficiency report system also corrupted the award system. Officers recommended their soldiers for medals in ways that reflected the unit's institutional needs as much as the soldiers' actual conduct. Medals were sometimes given to cover incidents that might otherwise have raised questions. Awards that should have been given were sometimes withheld because the action that merited them was one the institution preferred not to document in detail. The specific case of the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest American military decoration, illustrates some of the complexity. The Medal of Honor was awarded 246 times for service in Vietnam, and the process by which it was awarded was supposed to be rigorous and carefully documented. Many of those awards unquestionably recognized acts of extraordinary courage under fire. But the history of specific cases, when examined in detail, sometimes reveals a process that was as much about managing a narrative as about recognizing individual merit. Awards that were pushed through quickly because the unit needed a story of heroism at a particular moment. Awards that were held back because the circumstances of the action, accurately described, would have raised uncomfortable questions about what the unit had been doing and why. The intelligence war, meaning the specific effort to understand the enemy, track their movements, assess their intentions, and predict their actions, was characterized by a consistent pattern in which accurate analysis was subordinated to operational and political requirements. The intelligence products that reached policymakers were shaped by what policymakers wanted to hear. The analysis that diverged from the preferred picture was suppressed, revised, or sidelined. The institutional culture of the intelligence community in Vietnam was described by multiple insiders, in testimony given over years and decades, as one in which the analyst who wanted to advance understood that the path to advancement ran through agreement with the operational command's assessment, not through independent judgment. This produced specific and consequential failures. The most spectacular of these was the failure to anticipate the scale and coordination of the Tet Offensive, which struck American and South Vietnamese forces by surprise across the entire country simultaneously. The failure was not the result of absence of information. There was intelligence available before Tet, captured documents and prisoner interrogations and agent reports that indicated something significant was being planned. The intelligence was assessed in a framework that was predisposed to minimize enemy capability because the official picture required enemy weakness. The warnings were present. The analytical framework through which they had to pass distorted them. The offensive came as a surprise. The failure was studied internally. The study produced findings that were classified. The institutional response was to manage the representation of the failure rather than to address the analytical culture that had produced it. The analysts who had been closer to the truth were not promoted above the analyst who had agreed with the official picture. The institutional incentive structure did not change. The specific mechanisms through which political pressure had distorted intelligence analysis were not reformed in any systematic way. The war continued. The relationship between the press and the military in Vietnam is another dimension of the institutional story that has been thoroughly mythologized and insufficiently examined. The myth, which became influential partly because it served the institutional interests of both the military and the press, is that the press was adversarial, that its critical coverage of the war undermined public support and contributed to the defeat, that journalists were the mechanism by which the truth finally emerged. The reality is more complicated and less flattering to both institutions. Journalists in Vietnam operated in an environment created and managed by the military, which provided their transportation, their housing, their access to operations, and their information. The relationship was symbiotic and fraught. Journalists who reported in ways that the military found inconvenient found their access reduced or withdrawn. Journalists who maintained good relations with their military contacts got better access and better stories. The institutional pressure towards self-censorship in the press corps was real, visible, and documented by the journalists themselves in their memoirs and oral histories. The journalists who produced the most critical and accurate reporting on the war were, as a group, the ones with the least institutional connection to the military, who were therefore least vulnerable to access pressure, but also least likely to have the access that produced the best information. The result was a press corps that, with significant individual exceptions, reported the war within frameworks that were considerably more accepting of the official picture than the full evidence available would have supported. The celebrated adversarial relationship between the press and the military in Vietnam was real, but was not the dominant mode. The dominant mode was a managed accommodation that served both institutions' needs and left significant portions of the truth unreported. There were individual journalists who did extraordinary work. David Halberstam, Neil Sheehan, Seymour Hersh, Gloria Emerson, Peter Arnett, Jonathan Schell, among others, produced reporting that challenged the official picture in ways that were accurate and important. But they were exceptions, and their work appeared against a background of coverage that was considerably more accepting of official framing. The popular memory of the Vietnam press corps as uniformly critical and adversarial is itself a form of institutional narrative management, one that has served to make the exceptions look like the rule. The publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 represented the most significant single breach of the official narrative's management. The Papers, a classified study of American decision-making in Vietnam, commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and covering the period from 1945 to 1968, documented in detail the gap between what the government had told the public about the war and what it had known internally. The decision by Daniel Ellsberg to copy and distribute the papers to the New York Times and Washington Post and the subsequent legal battles over their publication produced a moment in which the institutional machinery of truth management was visible in a way it had never been before. The papers showed that multiple administrations had privately assessed the war's prospects as significantly less favorable than their public statements indicated. They showed that specific escalation decisions had been made with awareness that they were unlikely to achieve their stated objectives. They showed that the gap between the official picture and the internal analysis was not a product of inadequate information but of deliberate decision to present the more favorable version to the public. This was not ambiguous. It was documented in the government's own words, in its own classified documents. The Nixon administration's response to the publication of the papers was to attempt to prevent it through court injunction, which failed, and to pursue Ellsberg criminally, which ultimately also failed because of the government's own illegal conduct in its investigation of him. The institutional response to the exposure of systematic misrepresentation was, in other words, to attempt to prosecute the person who had exposed it while taking no action to address the misrepresentation itself. The officials whose decisions were documented in the papers, most of whom were no longer in government by 1971, were not prosecuted, not officially censured, not required to account for the decisions that the papers had made visible. Most of them continued successful careers in law, business, and academia. The soldiers in the field when the Pentagon Papers were published were still in the field. The war they were fighting in 1971 was the same war, managed by the same institutional machinery, operating on the same principles. The papers' publication did not change their orders, or their rules of engagement, or the body count system, or the efficiency report system. The institutional exposure of the official narrative's dishonesty did not in itself produce institutional change in the prosecution of the war. The war continued on its own terms. The end of the war, when it came, was managed with the same institutional care for appearances that had characterized its prosecution. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973, which produced the American military withdrawal, were presented as peace with honor. a formulation that was understood by almost everyone involved to be politically necessary rather than accurate. The Accords did not produce a stable peace. They produced an American withdrawal and a continued conflict between North and South Vietnam that ended in April of 1975 with the fall of Saigon. The scenes of the evacuation from the American embassy rooftop, helicopters lifting off as North Vietnamese forces entered the city, were the visual documentation of a conclusion that the official narrative had managed to avoid stating clearly for years. The South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians who had fought alongside American forces, who had been promised a reliable American commitment to their security, were left to the consequences of a conflict that had consumed decades of their lives and the lives of their families. The scale of what happened in Vietnam after American withdrawal, the re-education camps, the boat people, the decades of poverty and suppression that followed, is not part of the official American reckoning with the war, because incorporating it fully would require a kind of accounting for what the war had actually done that the institutional narrative had never been designed to support. The veterans came home from a war that had ended in a way no one was willing to describe accurately. They came home to a country that had decided, with some urgency, to move past the subject. They came home carrying knowledge that had no official place to exist, experiences that fit no available narrative, silences that had been trained into them by years of operating inside an institution that rewarded the appearance of success over the reality of what was happening. They carried this for years. Many of them are still carrying it. The ones still alive are old men now. Some of them have spoken. Many have not. The documents continue to be declassified slowly on schedules that reflect institutional priorities rather than the needs of history. The archives continue to contain material that has not been fully examined. The full accounting of what the United States did in Vietnam, what it knew, what it decided, what it reported, what it concealed, has not been completed. It may not be completed in the lifetimes of the people who were there. The institutional machinery that managed the war's representation did not disappear when the war ended. It became the template for how subsequent failures would be managed, how subsequent gaps between official narrative and operational reality would be handled, how the institution would continue to protect its own coherence at the cost of the truth that the people inside it were carrying. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March of 1973. The last American personnel were evacuated from Saigon on April 30th, 1975. Between those two dates, the war continued. After the second date, the consequences of the war continued, in the bodies of veterans, in the contaminated soil of a country saturated with chemicals, in the unexploded munitions scattered across 3 countries, in the political structures shaped by the war's outcome, in the institutional cultures of the organizations that had fought it. The war did not end when the fighting stopped. Some of what the war started has not stopped yet.